Okay, here we are again with the second half of the lecture on modernism. Elements of modernism. These are very important and you should be writing all these down. As I said before, modernism rejected Victorianism and everything that modernists would have associated with it. Sentimentality, optimism, the idea of progress. Instead, modernism is very pessimistic about society and technology. They are disillusioned and apathetic. This is, we can see this as the result of World War I. You had all this, go back and think about the Victorians and their Crystal Palace and their great exhibitions of technology and their faith in the future. Well, look where all that technology and faith in the future got you, right? It got the, the invention of the machine gun, the tank, mustard gas, barbed wire, new ways to kill thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people. That's where technology and optimism got you. So no wonder you are, and your faith in society. There's no sentiment close to Tennyson's poem about Charge of the Light Brigade, that their valiant sacrifice was worth it. No, the modernists see the sacrifices of the soldiers in World War I as a tragedy that should never have happened, not as something to be glorified, and it will be instructive to compare Tennyson's poem to the poem that you have to read for Monday, Dulce et Decorum Est, by Wilfred Owen. So, okay, modernists, pessimistic, World War I has disillusioned them, and they are apathetic. They don't care. Modernists also kind of see and often represent a culture and a civilization that they see in disarray or falling apart. Instead, think about those destructions of those old empires that happens through World War I. And they see, basically, a lot of modernists see their culture as being under attack or basically devolving. A lot of modernist literature may reflect the threat of mass culture, or the threat of commodification, especially to the individual. You can think about all those numbers for World War I, and this idea of just being a number, right? That this new culture that focuses on selling things to the most people at the most time, or the lowest common denominator, that can be really threatening to the individual. That individual characters, individual people are not valued. We often see, not always, but often, an urban aesthetic reflecting the rise of people living in cities. We've really made the transition to an industrial society. Most people live in cities, and that we'll see that reflected in modernist literature. Where the Victorians had a conflict between doubt and faith, that conflict is over for modernists, and it's basically, the result is despair. It's not that they're not sure God exists, it's that they're sure everything is horrible. And we can see this kind of apocalyptic despair. Instead of didacticism or works of literature that try to teach some kind of moral truth, modernist texts are going to be much more relativistic. They reflect relativism and skepticism about the very concept of truth. Like, there is no central truth, or if there is a central truth, it's not available to you. You could never know it. So there's no central truth. A lot of modernist texts will also focus on language's failure to communicate effectively, or the ways in which language and communication break down. That's also a reason why you can't access any kind of central truth, is because language can't communicate that perfectly. Also, by the time we have modernists like 1914 and so on, we've had the rise of Freud. We have these new concepts about psychology, about what is going on in your head, about these different kind of drives, the ego, the id, repression, these different kinds of concepts, and universal myths. Which also may raise the question of, hey, if I see this story about creation or a story about a leader or a savior in every culture or civilization, why am I so sure that my story, the story of my culture and civilization, is the true one? So we will see all of these are kind of the different themes or things that will be reflected in the content of a lot of the literature. Very quick overview, because you'll be getting a much more in-depth one on form. Remember, Ezra Pound says, make it new. Modernists concentrated on inventing new forms. In the novel, it's stream of consciousness narration. In poetry, it's free verse. Not all of it, not everything we're going to see looks radically new, but a lot of the stuff we're going to see. Fragmentation. Again, this is an issue that they look at the fragmentation of society, but we'll also see it reflected in the form of many of the works that we'll look at. For modernists, they often valued the individual instead of society. That's that concern about preserving the individual. The individual is kind of threatened by the nameless, faceless masses of society. And that complexity and difficulty are valued over harmony. And in this way, modernism is an elitist movement. They deliberately create works that are difficult to understand because they don't want everybody to understand their writing. Virginia Woolf, there's this kind of famous example of Virginia Woolf, who at a party, a woman said, "Oh, I haven't read your book, but my maid really didn't like it." And she said, "I don't write for your maid." Right? They were not interested in reaching everyone. They only wanted to reach a certain kind of audience. And as a result, unlike the 19th century, where we see our first kind of mass audience, in the 20th century, that mass audience gets divided up a little bit. And I have examples here from contemporary literature that you guys might be familiar with. Highbrow art for the elites and the intellectuals. Middlebrow art for the middle classes. And lowbrow art, working class entertainment. So we see this division between art. Then, modernism is not just a movement in literature. I wanted to use some pictures, and at this moment it would be helpful if you got out your Norton Anthology. I told you to look at the pictures in the middle. This time it would be helpful to look at those pictures. This picture is something that we've already talked about from the Lady of Shalott. Very traditional, representational, right? This looks like what it is. Nice reflection of where painting is in 1888. Okay, this is Pablo Picasso, painting in 1907. You can see how this is new and totally different from what came before it. Now, this painting is in your book, and I'm not going to recreate what's underneath it because it does a very good job of explaining what is modernist about this painting. But I would also explain, something that they don't necessarily go into detail about, which is by breaking with the formal tradition of one-point perspective, right, there's this idea of trying to look at things from different perspectives, looking at them in a new way, looking at them in a different way. Very much a concern of modernism. This painting is not in your book. Also by Pablo Picasso, Guernica. Right. This is about a battle, something that happened in the Spanish Civil War. Incredible painting, very moving. But this is a painting that Picasso's paintings are paintings that challenge the viewer and ask you to understand them in a different way. So, right, I think you can kind of get this, like, to painting, like, we'll see modernist literature, how modernist literature does this thing. The end. Very quickly, I would also say, like, if you think about movements in music, like jazz is incredibly fragmented. Jazz is also something that is usually produced for an elite audience. That, we can see these kinds of similar issues being taken up in painting, being taken up in music. In the paintings in your book, the over-the-top, the painting about World War I and the merry-go-round both get at some of the issues and like how the disillusionment and those things come out of World War I. The painting of the tube shelter perspective, if you look at those bodies in the tunnel, think about this issue of just being a number, just being one of a mass of people, which is like what people are like in the city. And this is something that's kind of reflected about living in the city. Think about how these works are kind of reflecting some of those issues.